In the shadows of America's traveling circuses, hidden beneath the sparkle of sequins and the roar of applause, stories of suffering often go untold. But occasionally, when compassion collides with cruelty, extraordinary things happen. This is the remarkable story of Ellie, a 50-year-old Asian elephant whose decades of abuse had left her broken in body and spirit. After a violent episode that injured a handler, she was deemed dangerous and scheduled for euthanasia, a death sentence for an animal who had already endured a lifetime of punishment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. No one expected that her salvation would come in the form of a 9-year-old girl named Lily Morgan, whose innocent determination would forge a connection that veterinarians, animal behaviorists, and circus trainers had all declared impossible. What unfolded in the months and years that followed would challenge our understanding of animal consciousness, transform a community, and prove that sometimes the purest form of wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. This is a story about second chances, about healing, and about how a child's vision of justice changed not just one life, but countless others. It begins in the dusty backyard of Stardust Circus, where an elephant had stopped performing and a little girl refused to accept the verdict of adults who claimed to know better. The small town of Riverdale, Missouri, had seen better days. Once, a thriving agricultural community with a picturesque main street that attracted tourists from neighboring states, it had gradually declined as farms consolidated and young people sought opportunities elsewhere. By the summer of 2018, its most notable features were the abandoned textile mill on the edge of town and the seasonal appearance of traveling shows, desperate enough to include Riverdale on their dwindling tour schedules. The arrival of Stardust. Circus in July barely warranted mention in the weekly Riverdale Register. The circus had been coming for years, setting up its modest collection of tents and trailers in the field behind the Walmart, where they performed the same tired routines. For increasingly sparse crowds, their star attraction, if one could call it that, was Ellie, an aging Asian elephant whose lethargic performances consisted of standing on her hind legs, spinning in slow circles, and carrying children on her back during intermission for $5 a ride. At first glance, most visitors saw only what the circus wanted them to see, an obedient animal performing simple tricks. Few noticed how Ellie's massive body was riddled with scars beneath the decorative blanket she wore during performances, or how her eyes seemed vacant, focused on nothing, as if she had retreated deep inside herself decades ago. Even fewer observed the subtle signs of distress, the repetitive swaying when confined to her chain, the way she flinched whenever a handler raised a bullhook, the patches of skin rubbed raw from years of restraint. But 9-year-old Lily Morgan noticed. Unlike most third graders, Lily spent her free time devouring books about animal behavior and wildlife conservation. Her bedroom walls were covered not with posters of pop stars, but with maps tracking endangered species populations and drawings she'd made of animals she hoped to save someday. Small for her age, with unruly auburn hair, she refused to let her mother tame and perpetually scraped knees from climbing trees to observe birds. Lily had the kind of fierce concentration that adults often found unsettling in a child so young. She doesn't see things like other kids, her father, James Morgan, once explained to a concerned teacher. She watches and notices patterns most adults miss. James, a widower who worked as a wildlife veterinarian at the modest Riverdale Animal Rescue Center, had nurtured his daughter's passion for animals since she was old enough to accompany him on calls. Though the center primarily treated injured local wildlife and abandoned pets, James had spent his early career working with endangered species in South Africa and Thailand. His stories of elephant families in the wild had captivated Lily since she was a toddler. On the opening night of Stardust Circus, James had reluctantly taken Lily, after weeks of her begging, to see a real elephant. He opposed the idea initially, uncomfortable with supporting animals in captivity, but eventually relented after making it a teaching moment about the differences between wild animals and those born into captivity. Just remember, the elephants you see in circuses aren't living the lives they're meant to live, he'd cautioned, as they found their seats on the metal bleachers. Their conversation had been cut short by the ringmaster's booming announcement introducing the majestic Ellie, Queen of India's jungles, as the elephant plodded into the ring. Where other children gasped in delight, Lily had gone completely still, her eyes narrowing as she studied the massive animal beneath the gaudy headpiece and spangled blanket. "Dad," she'd whispered, tugging his sleeve urgently. "Something's wrong with her." James had followed his daughter's gaze, seeing through the spectacle to the reality beneath, the protruding ribs, the arthritic gait, the dull resignation in the elephant's eyes. As a veterinarian, he recognized the signs of long-term neglect and suffering that the bright lights and circus music were designed to obscure. "You're right, Lily," he'd said quietly. "Something is very wrong." That visit had triggered something in Lily that her father hadn't anticipated. Over the following week, she had insisted on returning to the circus each day, not to watch the performances, but to observe Ellie during the off hours when visitors were allowed to wander the grounds before the evening shows. James had agreed, partly to support his daughter's interest and partly because his professional concern had been awakened. Away from the ring, in the makeshift pen behind the trailers, Ellie stood tethered by heavy chains that allowed her barely 10 feet of movement, in any direction. Hour after hour, Lily would sit on an overturned bucket just beyond the security rope, watching the elephant with an intensity that made the handlers uncomfortable. "You need something, kid?" Tom Reynolds, the head trainer, had asked on her third day of vigil. A heavy-set man with nicotine-stained fingers and the perpetual smell of cheap whiskey, Reynolds had been with Stardust for 20 years, inheriting Ellie from the previous trainer who'd broken her in. "Why does she sway like that?" Lily had asked, not looking away from Ellie. "And why are there sores on her legs where the chains are?" Reynolds had frowned, unused to children who asked such direct questions. "That's just what elephants do, and those ain't sores, just marks from her scratching herself. Now run along. This ain't a zoo where you can just stare at the animals all day." But Lily had returned the next day, and the next, sometimes with her sketchbook, sometimes with one of her father's veterinary textbooks, studying the elephant with the methodical focus of a scientist 3 times her age. On the 5th day, she'd brought an apple, holding it out tentatively toward Ellie, whose trunk had reached out with surprising gentleness to accept the offering. The moment their first connection was made, something had shifted in the elephant's demeanor, a slight alertness, a barely perceptible spark in the previously vacant eyes. The change was subtle, but significant enough that when Dr. Sarah Chen, the local veterinarian contracted to provide basic care for the circus animals, arrived for her weekly check, she noticed immediately. "Reynolds says you've got a little stalker," Dr. Chen remarked, as she examined Ellie, nodding toward Lily, who was perched on her bucket at the perimeter. "Interesting that Ellie seems calmer since she started coming around." The circus staff had developed a grudging tolerance for Lily's presence, particularly after James had introduced himself as a fellow veterinarian and offered some free advice on treating a minor infection in one of the performance horses. That professional courtesy had evolved into a tentative trust that allowed both father and daughter greater access to the backyard operations of Stardust than most visitors ever saw. What they observed troubled them deeply. Their medical records are practically non-existent, James told his colleague, Miguel Ramirez, over coffee at the Animal Rescue Center. Miguel, who specialized in large mammals and had occasionally consulted on cases at accredited zoos, shook his head as James described. Ellie's condition sounds like classic signs of prolonged psychological trauma, Miguel said. These traveling circuses are the worst. The animals spend most of their lives in transport cages or on chains, with no environmental enrichment, inconsistent medical care, and training methods from the Dark Ages. "Oh no," James sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "But Lily's obsessed. She's convinced Ellie is trying to communicate something. I've never seen her like this with any animal before, and I've taken her around plenty of exotic species." Miguel's expression softened at the mention of Lily, who had become a fixture at the rescue center since James had started bringing her to work after his wife Caroline's death from breast cancer 3 years earlier. The staff had watched the quiet, grief-stricken 6-year-old gradually transform into a passionate advocate for every injured creature that came through their doors. "Your daughter has a gift," Miguel said. "I saw her with those fox kits we rehabilitated last spring. They responded to her in ways they didn't with any of us, even though we followed the exact same protocols. Some people just have a connection with animals that goes beyond training or experience." "That's what worries me," James admitted. "She's already talking about saving Ellie. I don't know how to explain that a private citizen can't just rescue a circus elephant, especially not a single dad on a wildlife vet's salary." Miguel leaned forward, his expression serious. "You've told her that Stardust is leaving town next Monday, right? These attachments aren't good for her. That elephant has been performing for decades. It's all she knows. And these smaller circuses are struggling financially. They're not going to let go of their main attraction because a 9-year-old is concerned." James nodded, wishing he could make his compassionate daughter understand the harsh realities of animal ownership laws and economic pressures that kept creatures like Ellie performing long past when they should have been retired. What neither James nor Miguel knew was that events were already in motion that would make Lily's impossible dream suddenly, tragically possible. The incident occurred on Thursday afternoon during a sparsely attended matinee performance. Reynolds had been drinking more heavily than usual, frustrated by the poor turnout and the mounting pressure from the circus owner to make Ellie perform tricks she hadn't done in years. When the elephant balked at standing on her hind legs, a painful position given her arthritis, Reynolds had used the bullhook more aggressively than usual, digging the sharp point into a particularly sensitive spot behind her ear. Decades of conditioning had taught Ellie to suppress her natural responses to pain, but something in her broke that day. With a trumpeting cry that echoed through the half-empty tent, she had swung her trunk, knocking Reynolds 10 feet across the ring where he crashed into the safety barrier, breaking his arm and several ribs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The audience had erupted in screams, parents grabbing children and rushing for the exits, while other handlers scrambled to control the situation. By the time James and Lily arrived for their daily visit that evening, police tape surrounded the circus grounds, and a somber atmosphere had descended over the trailers and tents. "What happened?" James asked Dennis Mitchell, the elderly ticket taker who had become friendly with them over the past week. "Ellie had enough of Reynolds' bullshit. Pardon my French," Mitchell replied, glancing apologetically at Lily. "Can't say I blame her, but it's bad news. Owner's talking about putting her down, says she's too dangerous now, and she's getting too old to perform anyway. Insurance won't cover her after this." Lily's face had drained of color. "They're going to kill her. They can't do that. It wasn't her fault." Mitchell had looked at the little girl with genuine sadness. "I'm sorry, kiddo. Reynolds is pressing charges, claiming the elephant is dangerous and unmanageable. He's got the medical bills to back him up. The circus can't afford the liability, and nobody wants to take on an aging elephant with a record of violence." "But she was protecting herself." Lily protested, her voice rising. "Dad, tell them she was just defending herself." James had put a steadying hand on his daughter's shoulder, feeling her trembling with outrage. "It's not that simple. Lily, legally, Ellie is property, not a person who can claim self-defense. That's stupid. She feels pain just like we do." Mitchell nodded in agreement. "You're not wrong, little lady. Been working circuses for 40 years, and I've seen things that would turn your stomach. But the law doesn't see it that way." As they'd walked back to the car, Lily had remained uncharacteristically silent, her small face set in an expression James recognized all too well. The same determination Caroline had shown when facing impossible odds. It was the look his wife had worn when doctors gave her 6 months to live, and she'd responded by signing up for an experimental treatment program, fighting for 2 more precious years with her family. "I know what you're thinking, Lily," he'd said gently as they drove home. "But we can't save every animal, no matter how much we want to." "Mom would have tried," she'd replied simply, staring out the window at the gathering dusk. "She always said that just because something seems impossible doesn't mean you shouldn't try." James couldn't argue with that. Caroline Morgan had been the most determined person he'd ever known. It was why he'd fallen in love with her during their veterinary school days, when she'd spent nights sleeping in the kennels to monitor a litter of critically ill puppies everyone else had given up. All 4 had survived, defying medical expectations. That evening, after putting Lily to bed, James had made some calls to colleagues in the zoo and wildlife sanctuary communities, seeking options for Ellie. The responses had been uniformly discouraging. An elderly elephant with aggression issues? No reputable facility will take that liability, said his former classmate who now worked at the San Diego Zoo. And the few elephant sanctuaries in the US have waiting lists years long. "What about euthanasia?" James had asked reluctantly. "Probably the most humane option at this point," his colleague had replied. "Better than being sold to an even worse situation or spending her final years in isolation because she's too dangerous to manage." "I'm sorry, James. I know that's not what you wanted to hear." Later that night, unable to sleep, James had found Lily sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts of articles about elephant cognition, sanctuary success stories, and legal precedents involving circus animals. "I made a plan," she announced without preamble, pushing a neatly written list toward him. "First, we need to get a petition so they don't kill Ellie before we can help her. Then, we need to find her a sanctuary. I found 3 that might work. Then we need money to transport her, but I thought maybe we could do a fundraiser like when Tommy's mom had cancer and the whole town helped." James had sat down heavily, both impressed by his daughter's research and heartbroken at the impossibility of her plan. "Lily, honey, I've been making calls. It's not as simple as finding a place that will take her. There are legal issues, transportation logistics, medical concerns. But we have to try, Dad," Lily had insisted, her green eyes so like Caroline's, bright with unshed tears. "Ellie looks at me like she knows what's happening. She's scared, and she's been hurt for so long. We can't just let them kill her because it's easier." In that moment, looking at his determined daughter, James had felt something shift inside him. Perhaps it was the memory of Caroline's voice telling him that the most meaningful victories were always the least likely ones. Or maybe it was the recognition that his daughter, despite her age, understood something fundamental about justice and compassion that many adults had forgotten. "Okay," he'd said finally. "I'm not promising anything, but let's see what we can. First thing tomorrow, we'll talk to Mayor Wilkins. She owes me a favor after I treated her prize mastiffs for parvo last winter." Lily had launched herself into his arms with a sob of relief. "Thank you, Dad. I know we can save her. I just know it." As he held his daughter, James wondered if he'd just made a promise he couldn't possibly keep. The odds against them were overwhelming, financial, legal and logistical barriers that seemed insurmountable. But something in Ellie's eyes had gotten to him too, a depth of awareness that had stirred his professional curiosity and his compassion. What neither father nor daughter yet realized was that their quest to save one broken elephant would soon reveal extraordinary hidden depths in the animal they sought to rescue, in their community and in themselves. The journey ahead would challenge everything they thought they knew about healing, communication, and the remarkable capacity for renewal that lies dormant in the most wounded souls, both human and animal. As Lily finally went to bed clutching the first elephant book James had ever given her, she whispered the promise she'd made to Ellie that afternoon, standing at the edge of the pen while handlers secured the troubled elephant with extra chains. "I won't let them hurt you anymore, no matter what." Miles away, in the darkened circus grounds, Ellie stood motionless under her additional restraints, her massive body seeming to sink under the weight of decades of captivity. But deep in her ancient eyes, something had changed. A spark of connection, forged with a small human who had looked at her and truly seen her suffering. For the first time in years, the elephant's awareness had expanded beyond the narrow cycle of compliance and punishment that had defined her existence. Something was different now. Something had awakened. The morning after her late-night conversation with her father, Lily Morgan woke before dawn. She dressed quickly in the half-light, pulling on her favorite faded blue jeans and the future wildlife conservationist t-shirt her father had given her for her last birthday. Without making breakfast or even stopping for her usual glass of orange juice, she slipped out the back door and pedaled her bike through the quiet streets of Riverdale. Morning mist still clung to the fields surrounding the Walmart parking lot, where Stardust Circus had established its temporary home. The big top looked shabby in the early light. Its once vibrant red and blue stripes faded to dull pastels after years on the road. A few workers were already awake, moving silently around the grounds with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to temporary existences. Lily abandoned her bike at the perimeter and slipped under the security tape. The police had come and gone the previous day, leaving only the fluttering yellow plastic as evidence of the incident, as circus management was now calling it. She made her way to Ellie's enclosure, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. The scene that greeted her made her stomach clench. Overnight, Ellie's situation had deteriorated dramatically. The elephant stood immobilized by additional chains, her massive legs now shackled at multiple points, restricting her movement to almost nothing. A muzzle-like restraint had been fitted over her trunk, and two unfamiliar handlers stood nearby, nervously clutching bullhooks. "You can't come back here today, kid," one of them called when he spotted Lily. "Elephant's under quarantine." "She's not sick," Lily protested, standing her ground despite her racing heart. "She's just scared and hurt." The younger handler stepped forward, his expression torn between sympathy and firmness. "Listen, this isn't a petting zoo. That animal put a man in the hospital yesterday. Management's just waiting on the paperwork to have her euthanized. For your own safety, you need to leave." "When?" Lily asked, her voice suddenly small. "When are they going to do it?" "Vet's coming Monday morning before we pull out," the man replied. "Now go home before I have to call security." Lily took a few reluctant steps backward, her eyes never leaving Ellie. The elephant's gaze followed her, and even through her fear, Lily could sense something in those ancient eyes, a consciousness, a plea, an awareness that made the handler's casual discussion of her execution all the more horrifying. "I'm coming back," she whispered too quietly for the men to hear. "I promise." By the time Lily returned home, her father was in the kitchen making pancakes, his Saturday morning ritual. One look at her face told him where she'd been. "You went to see Ellie," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. Lily nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "They've got her all chained up, Dad, and they've decided to kill her on Monday before they leave town." We don't have much time. James set down the spatula and pulled his daughter into a hug. I made an appointment with Mayor Wilkins for 9 o'clock, he told her. I've also called Dr. Chen to see if she'll support a delay in the euthanasia order on medical grounds. Lily pulled back, wiping her eyes with determination. I made posters last night, she said, and I emailed all my teachers and the parents. From my class, we need to show everyone that Ellie isn't dangerous. She was just defending herself. Lily, James said gently, you need to prepare yourself. Even if we can delay what's happening, finding a solution for Ellie is going to be incredibly difficult. No reputable sanctuary will take an elephant with a record of aggression, and private ownership is both illegal in most states and completely impractical. Then we'll make our own sanctuary, Lily replied, with the simple logic of a child who hadn't yet learned to see impossible barriers. Riverdale has had lots of empty space since the factory closed, and you know about taking care of animals. James opened his mouth to explain the countless reasons why that couldn't happen. Zoning laws, specialized care requirements, enormous ongoing costs, but stopped when he saw the desperate hope in his daughter's eyes. Let's start with the mayor, he said instead. One step at a time. Riverdale's town hall occupied a stately brick building at the center of Main Street, its white columns and clock tower a reminder of more prosperous times. Mayor Patricia Wilkins, a formidable woman in her 60s who had held office for nearly 20 years, received them in an office decorated with photos of her championship mastiffs alongside civic awards and certificates. James Morgan, she said warmly, rising from behind her desk. And this must be Lily. I've heard wonderful things about your work at the Animal Rescue Center, young lady. Lily shook the mayor's outstretched hand with surprising formality. Thank you for seeing us, Mayor Wilkins. We're here about Ellie. Ellie? The mayor asked, her brow furrowing. The elephant at Stardust Circus, James explained. There was an incident yesterday. Ah, yes, Mayor Wilkins nodded, her expression turning serious. Tom Reynolds is a second, cousin of my husband's. Nasty business. He's still at County General with a broken arm and 3 cracked ribs. Could have been much worse from what I hear. The elephant was provoked, Lily blurted out. Mr. Reynolds hurts her all the time with that hook thing. She was just trying to stop the pain. Mayor Wilkins regarded the child with a mixture of surprise and consideration. That's a serious accusation, young lady. James stepped in smoothly. As a veterinarian who spent significant time observing this particular elephant, I have deep concerns about her treatment and condition. The behavioral episode yesterday was consistent with an animal responding to chronic pain and psychological distress, not unprovoked aggression. The mayor leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. I appreciate your professional opinion, James, but the fact remains that we have an injured citizen and a potentially dangerous animal. The circus has the legal right to dispose of their property as they see fit. She's not property, Lily exclaimed, her voice cracking. She's a living being who feels pain and fear, just like your dogs do. A brief silence followed this outburst. Then, to both Morgan's surprise, Mayor Wilkins smiled slightly. You remind me of myself at your age, she told Lily. I once chained myself to a tree they wanted to cut down for the new post office. My father was mortified, but that oak is still standing in the town square. She turned to James. What exactly are you proposing here? First, a stay of execution to allow for proper evaluation, James replied, seizing the opening. Dr. Chen is willing to provide documentation questioning the circus's characterization of the incident. Second, time to explore potential sanctuary placements or other humane options. And third, Lily added boldly, permission to hold a town meeting to talk about finding Ellie a permanent home here in Riverdale. James shot his daughter a startled look. This hadn't been part of their discussed strategy. The mayor, however, seemed more intrigued than dismissive. Riverdale hasn't had an exotic animal ordinance since old Henry Patterson kept those ostriches back in the 90s, she mused. We had to draft special regulations after one got loose and terrorized the Methodist church picnic. This would be different, James assured her quickly. Any solution would involve proper facilities, expert care, and all appropriate permits. We're just asking for time to explore possibilities. Mayor Wilkins studied them both for a long moment. I can issue a municipal hold, delaying any euthanasia for 48 hours on public safety review grounds. That's within my authority, but it only buys you until Wednesday morning, and the circus plans to leave Monday. Can you prevent them from leaving with Ellie? Lily asked. The mayor shook her head. Not without cause. Private property rights are strong in this county. However, she added, seeing Lily's face fall, I could perhaps require a safety inspection of all attractions following the incident, which might delay their departure by a day or two. Thank you, James said sincerely. And the town meeting? Town hall is available tomorrow afternoon at 4, Mayor Wilkins replied, after checking her calendar. I'll have my assistant post the notice. But James, she added, her voice softening, don't build up unrealistic expectations. Riverdale isn't exactly flush with resources these days. As they left Town Hall, Lily was already planning their next moves. I'll put up posters around town about the meeting, she declared, and we need to get people to see Ellie, to understand she's not dangerous. I think the circus management might have something to say about that, James cautioned, especially after Mayor Wilkins issues the stay order. Lily's expression turned thoughtful. Then we need someone on the inside, she said. Someone who can help us. To James's surprise, his daughter led him directly to Stardust's ticket booth, where Dennis Mitchell was preparing for the day's first performance. Mr. Mitchell, Lily addressed the elderly ticket-taker without preamble. Do you want Ellie to die? The old man blinked at the direct question. Course not, kid. Worked with that elephant for 15 years, but it's not up to me. It could be, Lily insisted. We're having a town meeting tomorrow about saving her, but we need someone who knows Ellie to tell people the truth about how she's been treated. Mitchell glanced around nervously. Look, I need this job. Don't have much else at my age. Don't you have a sister in Riverdale? James asked, recalling something Mitchell had mentioned during one of their conversations. Marlene, who runs the bakery on Oak Street, Mitchell nodded reluctantly. Yeah, that's why I don't mind when Stardust comes to this particular town. Get to see her and the nieces for a few days. Wouldn't it be nice to see them more often? Lily pressed, her young face earnest. If Ellie stayed, maybe you could too. The old man's weathered face softened. You're something else, kid. Can't promise anything, but I'll think about your meeting. As they walked away, James gave his daughter an appraising look. That was some pretty sophisticated persuasion for a 9-year-old, Lily shrugged. Mom always said you have to help people see how doing the right thing is also good for them. The mention of Carolyn brought a bittersweet smile to James's face. His late wife had indeed been a master at aligning others' interests with the greater good. It was how she'd built the Animal Rescue Center from a one-woman operation into a community institution. Their next stop was the Riverdale Register, where editor Frank Taylor greeted them with characteristic bluntness. Heard about your elephant crusade from Patricia, he said, referring to the mayor by her first name as most long-time Riverdale residents did. Making a story out of it, are you? We're hoping you might, James replied. There are some serious animal welfare concerns here that the public should know about. Frank snorted. Public around here barely cares about human welfare these days. Since the mill closed, all anyone wants to read is who's hiring and who's leaving. But what if Ellie could bring jobs to Riverdale? Lily asked. Sanctuaries need staff, and visitors would come to see her, which means they'd eat at restaurants and shop in stores. Frank gave her an amused look. You've got your pitch down, I'll give you that. He turned to James. What exactly are you envisioning here, Doc? Some kind of zoo? Not a zoo, James clarified. A rehabilitation facility, potentially. We're still exploring options. Frank tapped his pen against his desk. Tell you what, I'll send Jessica to cover your town meeting. She's been looking for something meatier than high school basketball scores. But I'm not promising the front page. By noon, word was spreading through Riverdale's limited social networks. James had posted in the community Facebook group, where debate was already heating up between those sympathetic to the elephant's plight and others who prioritized human safety. Lily and her best friend Zoe had hand-delivered flyers to businesses along Main Street, receiving responses that ranged from enthusiastic support to polite dismissal. Old Man Gunderson said keeping an elephant in Riverdale is the stupidest thing he's ever heard, Zoe reported as they taped another flyer to the lamppost outside the hardware store. Old Man Gunderson says that about everything, Lily replied, without concern. Remember when he said the internet was just a fad? Their impromptu campaign headquarters became Sarah's Cafe, where owner Sarah Rodriguez had immediately offered free coffee to anyone who came in to discuss the elephant situation, as it was now being called around town. By mid-afternoon, a surprising number of residents had stopped by, curious about the unusual cause that had suddenly animated their sleepy community. Never thought I'd see the day, Sarah commented as she refilled James's coffee cup. Haven't had this many customers since we hosted the debate when they were threatening to close the high school. Not all the attention was positive. Tom Reynolds's family had deep roots in Riverdale, and many residents considered his injuries proof enough that the elephant was dangerous and unpredictable. A small but vocal contingent, led by Reynolds's brother-in-law, who owned the local construction company, had begun circulating a counter-petition supporting the circus's right to handle their property as they saw fit. The most troubling development came in the late afternoon, when Percy Winters, the local attorney who represented Stardust Circus during their annual visits, arrived at the Animal Rescue Center, where James had returned to handle his regular Saturday appointments. "Cease and desist," Winters announced without preamble, slapping a document on the reception desk. "My clients are aware of your activities today and consider them tortious interference with their business operations. They're also preparing an injunction against Mayor Wilkins's stay order, which exceeds her authority." James scanned the document, his heart sinking. Though filled with legal jargon, the message was clear. Stardust Circus was prepared to fight any attempt to interfere with their management of Ellie, including her scheduled euthanasia. "Your clients are planning to destroy valuable property without proper evaluation," James countered, thinking quickly. "As a licensed veterinarian who's observed the animal in question, I have professional concerns about both the necessity and humaneness of their planned course of action." Winters smirked. "Save the speeches for your town meeting, Morgan. Stardust has 3 veterinarians on retainer who'll testify that the elephant poses an imminent danger and cannot be safely relocated or rehabilitated. They'll also attest that euthanasia is the most humane option given her age and condition. Vets who've never examined her," James pointed out, "doesn't matter. They have the specialized expertise in circus animals that you lack." Winters adjusted his tie with a satisfied expression. "Face it, you're delaying the inevitable and potentially exposing yourself to liability in the process." After the attorney left, James called Dr. Chen, who had been present during several of his and Lily's visits, to observe Ellie. "They're pushing back hard," he told her. "Any chance you'd go on record with your professional assessment of Ellie's condition and behavior?" Dr. Chen hesitated. "James, I've been the circus vet for 6 years. I see these animals for maybe an hour during each tour stop. I've documented the physical issues, the arthritis, the pressure sores from chains, the dental problems, but I've never formally evaluated her behavioral health. But you've seen enough to know that what happened with Reynolds wasn't unprovoked aggression, James pressed. You said to yourself that Ellie seemed calmer when Lily was around. Yes, and that's actually quite remarkable, Dr. Chen admitted. Asian elephants, especially those with trauma histories, don't typically form rapid attachments to strangers. The fact that she responded positively to your daughter is scientifically interesting, but it doesn't negate 40 years of captivity and training methods that have left her psychologically damaged. James ran a hand through his hair in frustration. So you're saying she can't be saved? I'm saying it would be exceptional. Dr. Chen's voice softened. But then again, your daughter seems to specialize in exceptional connections with animals. I'll review my records and see what I can document that might help. By the time James returned home that evening, he was mentally exhausted from navigating the day's unexpected challenges. He found Lily at the kitchen table, surrounded by books and printouts about elephant sanctuaries, cognitive abilities of pachyderms, and successful rehabilitation cases. "Did you know that elephants recognize themselves in mirrors?" she asked, without looking up. "That means they have self-awareness, like humans and dolphins and some great apes, and they mourn their dead and remember places they haven't been for decades." "I did know that," James replied, setting his keys down and joining her at the table. "They're remarkable animals." "So we can't let them kill Ellie," Lily stated with simple conviction, especially not just because she finally stood up for herself after years of being hurt. James regarded his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. At 9 years old, she was already showing the moral clarity and passion that had defined Caroline's approach to the world, seeing injustice and moving instinctively to address it, regardless of obstacles. But he also recognized his responsibility to protect her from the crushing disappointment of a failed crusade. "Lily, I need you to understand something," he said carefully. "We're going to do everything we can for Ellie, but the legal and practical barriers are enormous. Stardust has rights as her owner, and they're already fighting back against our efforts." Lily finally looked up from her research, her expression surprisingly serene for a child her age. "Dad, remember when Mom got sick and the first doctor said there was nothing we could do?" James nodded, his throat tightening at the memory. "But she didn't accept that," Lily continued. "She found other doctors and other treatments. She said that just because the path isn't clear doesn't mean there isn't one." "Your mother was extraordinary," James said softly. "So is Ellie," Lily replied with absolute certainty, "and I think Mom would say that fighting for someone who can't fight for themselves is always worth it, even if you might lose." Looking into his daughter's determined face, James felt a complex mix of emotions: grief for the wife he'd lost too soon, pride in the daughter who carried her spirit, and a growing conviction that perhaps the impossible task before them was exactly what both he and Lily needed. Caroline had always believed that the act of striving for what was right held its own value, regardless of outcome. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this smartly. We need to understand exactly what we're up against and build a coalition of support. This isn't just about convincing people that Ellie deserves better. It's about creating a viable alternative that addresses legitimate concerns about safety, funding, and long-term care." Lily nodded solemnly. "I know. That's why I've been researching successful sanctuary models and rehabilitation techniques for traumatized elephants." As night fell over Riverdale, father and daughter worked side by side at the kitchen table, preparing for the town meeting that might determine whether one elderly elephant would find salvation or execution in their small community. Neither fully appreciated yet how their campaign was already sending ripples through Riverdale, awakening dormant community bonds and forcing people to consider questions of ethical responsibility that extended far beyond one animal's fate. Meanwhile, across town, Ellie stood motionless in her restraints, conserving her energy as she had learned to do through decades of captivity. But something had changed in her ancient consciousness, a spark of connection, a glimmer of awareness that extended beyond her immediate suffering. For the first time in years, the aging elephant was sensing a shift in the unchanging pattern of her existence. Whether that change would bring release or simply a different form of confinement remained to be seen. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect early autumn day that usually found Riverdale's residents attending church services or enjoying outdoor activities before winter set in. But today, an unusual energy pulsed through the small town as people discussed the upcoming town meeting and the strange campaign to save an elephant that had injured a local man. Lily awoke early, unable to contain her nervous energy. While her father made breakfast, she slipped out of the house with a small backpack containing apples, carrots, and her notebook. She wanted to see Ellie one more time before the town meeting to gather any observations that might help their case. She arrived at the circus grounds. She found an unexpected scene. A small crowd had gathered at the perimeter of Ellie's enclosure, not circus-goers, but townspeople who had come out of curiosity after hearing about the controversy. Some were clearly supporters, carrying handmade signs with messages like, "Justice for Ellie, and animals have rights too." Others appeared more skeptical, keeping their distance and muttering about dangerous wild animals. Security had been increased, with 2 uniformed men stationed at the entrance to Ellie's pen. But to Lily's surprise, Dennis Mitchell was arguing with them, gesturing emphatically toward the elephant. When he spotted Lily, he waved her over. "Tell them," he said as soon as she approached. "Tell them what you've been doing with Ellie." Lily glanced uncertainly between Mitchell and the guards. "I've just been watching her," she said cautiously, "and sometimes give her apples." One of the guards, a heavy-set man with a crew cut, shook his head. "Orders from management. No visitors near the elephant until further notice." "She hasn't eaten since yesterday morning," Mitchell persisted. "Won't take food from any of the handlers. Kid might be able to get her to eat something." The guards exchanged glances. "That girl who's been coming around all week?" the younger one asked. Mitchell nodded. "Ellie responds to her. Never seen anything like it." After a brief consultation, the older guard reluctantly agreed. 5 minutes, and only as far as the safety barrier. If that animal so much as flicks her trunk in your direction, you're out. Lily stepped cautiously into the enclosure, acutely aware of the eyes watching her. Not just the guards and Mitchell, but the growing crowd of townspeople whose murmurs subsided as they observed the small girl approaching the massive chained elephant. Ellie stood motionless, her head hanging low, chains restricting her movement from all sides. The trunk muzzle had been removed, but the elephant appears uninterested in using her newfound freedom, even to eat the hay that had been placed nearby. "Hi, Ellie," Lily said softly, stopping at the indicated safety line, still several yards from the elephant. "I brought you something." At the sound of Lily's voice, Ellie's head lifted slightly. Her right ear flicked forward, a subtle gesture, but one that Dr. Chen had previously explained indicated attention in elephants. Lily removed an apple from her backpack and held it out. "Are you hungry? It's a honey crisp, my favorite kind." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with deliberate slowness, Ellie extended her trunk toward Lily, reaching across the safety boundary. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, and one of the guards stepped forward with his hand on his taser. "Wait," Mitchell hissed. "Just watch." The elephant's trunk stopped just short of Lily's outstretched hand. Instead of taking the apple, Ellie gently touched the girl's wrist with the sensitive tip of her trunk, an almost imperceptible contact that nonetheless sent a visible shiver through Lily's small frame. "She's saying hello," Lily explained to the startled guards, her voice steady despite the extraordinary moment. "This is how elephants greet friends they trust." Only after this greeting did Ellie finally accept the apple, bringing it carefully to her mouth. The entire interaction had a deliberateness, an awareness that struck even the skeptical observers as remarkable. From the edge of the crowd, Jessica Ramirez, the young reporter from the Riverdale Register, was frantically taking notes and photos. Next to her stood Dr. Sarah Chen, who had arrived to conduct what might be her final wellness check on Ellie before the scheduled euthanasia. "Have you ever seen her interact with anyone like that?" Jessica asked the veterinarian. Dr. Chen shook her head, professional composure momentarily forgotten as she watched the exchange between child and elephant. "Never. Captive elephants, especially those with Ellie's history, typically maintain distance from humans whenever possible. This is unusual." Lily remained with Ellie for her allotted 5 minutes, feeding her the remaining apples and carrots, while talking in a low, constant stream about their plans for the town meeting, about potential sanctuaries, about a future where Ellie wouldn't be chained or forced to perform. The most striking moment came just as Lily was being told her time was up. She stepped back reluctantly, saying, "I have to go now, but I'll be back after the meeting. We're going to help you, I promise." Ellie, who had been watching the girl with unwavering attention, slowly reached her trunk to the ground and used the tip to trace what appeared to be a deliberate pattern in the dirt. Dr. Chen pushed forward through the crowd, her scientific curiosity piqued. "What did she just do?" she asked Lily, who was staring at the marks with fascination. "I think she drew a circle," Lily replied, pointing to the roughly circular pattern in the dust. "And look, there's a smaller one inside it." The veterinarian examined the markings with growing amazement. "Captive elephants have been taught to make artistic marks before, but I've never seen Ellie do anything like this, and certainly not unprompted." The security guards, uncomfortable with the growing crowd and the unexpected behavior from their charge, finally insisted that everyone leave. But as people dispersed toward their cars, the buzz of conversation carried a new tone. Less about the danger of an aggressive elephant and more about the surprising intelligence they had just witnessed. "Did you see how gentle she was with the girl? I didn't know elephants could draw. Seemed like they were actually communicating somehow." By the time Lily rejoined her father at home, word of the morning's events had already spread through Riverdale's efficient small-town grapevine, adding a new dimension to the afternoon's town meeting. "You should have seen it, Dad," Lily exclaimed as she recounted the experience. "She wasn't just taking the food, she was talking to me in her way." James, who had spent the morning on the phone with colleagues at bigger zoos and wildlife centers across the country, listened with a mixture of interest and concern. "Sweetie, we need to be careful about anthropomorphizing. That means assuming animals think like humans. Elephants are incredibly intelligent, but their cognition is different from ours." "I know that," Lily insisted. "But Ellie was trying to tell me something with those circles. I could feel it." Before James could respond, his phone rang, Dr. Chen calling from the circus grounds. "James, I just completed Ellie's examination, and there's something you should know before the meeting," she said without preamble. "I've been reviewing my notes from the past 6 years, and there's a pattern I hadn't fully appreciated until now." "What kind of pattern?" James asked, putting the call on speaker so Lily could hear. "Periods of increased alertness, and what I'd call cognitive engagement that don't match her physical condition," Dr. Chen explained. "Despite worsening arthritis and other age-related issues, she's shown episodes of what appears to be problem-solving behavior, figuring out how to reach food placed just beyond her chains, manipulating locks with her trunk, even what might be interpreted as deliberate communication with certain handlers. Like she's been hiding her intelligence?" Lily suggested eagerly. More like selectively revealing it, Dr. Chen corrected. Many captive animals, especially those subjected to harsh training, develop a kind of learned helplessness. But occasionally, I've documented instances where Ellie seemed to break through that pattern, usually when she wasn't being observed by her trainers. And this morning with Lily was one of those instances, James concluded, beginning to understand the significance. The most dramatic I've seen, Dr. Chen confirmed. I'm amending my medical report to include these observations. I can't ethically support euthanasia for an animal displaying this level of cognitive function and social engagement without attempting rehabilitation first. This unexpected professional support bolstered their case considerably, and by the time the Morgans arrived, at Town Hall at 3:30, the meeting room was already filled with curious Riverdale residents. Mayor Wilkins had moved the gathering to the largest available space, but even so, people were soon standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. "Quite the turnout," Frank Taylor commented, as James and Lily found seats near the front. The newspaper editor nodded toward the door, where Jessica was still interviewing people as they entered. "I haven't seen this many folks interested in local politics since the mill closing announcement." The diversity of the crowd surprised even James, who had lived in Riverdale for over a decade. Alongside the expected animal lovers and environmental activists were farmers, factory workers, business owners, teachers, and even high school students who had apparently decided that an elephant controversy was more interesting than their usual Sunday activities. At precisely 4, Mayor Wilkins called the meeting to order. "Citizens of Riverdale," she began, her authoritative voice immediately quieting the room. "We are here to discuss an unusual situation regarding an elephant named Ellie, currently with Stardust Circus, and her scheduled euthanasia following an incident involving local resident Thomas Reynolds." The mayor efficiently outlined the facts as they were currently understood, then invited James to present the case for intervention. As he approached the podium, he felt a moment of doubt. He was a veterinarian accustomed to treating injured hawks and orphaned fawns, not an advocate in a community dispute. But then he caught sight of Lily's encouraging nod from the front row, and something of Caroline's spirit seemed to flow through him. "Most of you know me as the wildlife vet from the rescue center," he began simply. "What you may not know is that I spent the early part of my career working with elephants in Thailand and South Africa. I've seen these animals both in captivity and in the wild, and I can tell you that what my daughter and I have observed in Ellie is extraordinary." Over the next 15 minutes, James presented a clear, science-based assessment of Ellie's physical condition, the typical effects of circus training methods, and the growing evidence of her cognitive abilities. He carefully addressed safety concerns, acknowledged the legal complexities, and outlined several potential paths forward, from temporary placement at the rescue center while they sought sanctuary options to the more ambitious possibility of establishing Riverdale's own elephant rehabilitation facility. "This isn't just about saving one elephant," he concluded. "It's about who we want to be as a community. Do we turn away from suffering when we see it, or do we rise to meet challenges that matter, even when they're difficult?" Next came Percy Winters, representing Stardust Circus. The attorney presented a very different picture, one of a dangerous, unpredictable animal that had attacked her handler without provocation after decades of professional care. He emphasized the circus's legal ownership rights, the financial burden Ellie represented as she aged beyond her performing years, and the potential liability to the town should they interfere with established veterinary recommendations for euthanasia. While the emotion surrounding this issue is understandable, Winters concluded smoothly, we must recognize that these decisions are best left to professionals with specific expertise in exotic animals, not well-meaning amateurs or impressionable children. The pointed reference to Lily drew murmurs of disapproval from some in the audience, and Mayor Wilkins intervened before opening the floor for community input. I'd remind everyone to keep comments respectful. We'll now hear from citizens, beginning with those who have direct knowledge of the situation. To James's surprise, the first person to approach the microphone was Dennis Mitchell, still wearing his Stardust Circus uniform. "I've worked with circus animals for 40 years, the elderly man began, his voice wavering slightly. "See how they're trained, how they live, how they die when they're not useful anymore? Most of us handlers, we just accept it as the way things are. But what I've seen this past week between that elephant and this little girl," he gestured toward Lily, "made me question things I've never questioned before." Mitchell described Ellie's dramatic change in behavior since Lily had begun visiting, the increased alertness, the responsiveness, and most tellingly, the elephant's refusal to eat from anyone else's hand after the incident with Reynolds. "I can't say if she's especially smart for an elephant," Mitchell concluded. "But I can tell you, she knows exactly who's trying to help her and who isn't, and that seems like the kind of intelligence that deserves a second chance." Dr. Chen spoke next, providing professional validation for many of James and Lily's observations. She presented her amended medical report, highlighting the disconnect between Ellie's worsening physical condition and her increasing cognitive engagement. Most significantly, she formally recommended against euthanasia on both medical and ethical grounds. As the veterinarian who has been overseeing this animal's care during Stardust's annual visits to Riverdale, I cannot in good conscience support destruction without first attempting rehabilitation, she stated firmly. The interaction I witnessed this morning suggests capacities for trust, communication, and social bonding that warrant further study and intervention. The professional testimony shifted the room's energy perceptibly. Even some who had entered, skeptical, were now listening with greater openness to the possibility that Ellie's situation might not be as straightforward as they'd initially assumed. Then came Lily's turn to speak. James had debated whether his 9-year-old daughter should address the crowded room, but Lily had insisted that since she had the most direct experience with Ellie, her perspective mattered. Now, watching her walk confidently to the microphone that Mayor Wilkins had lowered for her, he felt a surge of pride mixed with anxiety. "My name is Lily Morgan, and I'm in 4th grade at Riverdale Elementary," she began, her clear voice carrying surprisingly well through the packed room. "For the past week, I've been visiting Ellie every day, watching her and learning about her. I think she's been learning about me, too." With disarming directness, Lily described her interactions with the elephant. Not just the feeding and physical responses, but the moments of connection she had felt. She explained how Ellie's eyes had changed over their days together, becoming more focused and expressive. She described the trunk drawing in the dirt that morning and her conviction that it represented deliberate communication. "I know some grown-ups think kids just make up things or get too emotional about animals," she acknowledged with a wisdom beyond her years. "But when you spend time with someone, even if that someone is an elephant, you start to understand them. Ellie doesn't want to hurt anyone. She just doesn't want to be hurt anymore." Lily reached into her pocket and unfolded a sheet of paper. "I looked up what happens when an elephant is euthanized. They use special drugs because elephants are so big, but sometimes it goes wrong and they suffer." Her voice trembled slightly. "Ellie has already suffered enough. Please, don't let her last moments be painful and scary with people who don't love her." The room fell silent as the child returned to her seat. Even Percy Winters seemed momentarily at a loss for how to counter the simple emotional truth of Lily's plea. The community discussion that followed revealed both divisions and unexpected alliances. Some residents expressed valid concerns about safety and funding. Others saw potential economic benefits in establishing Riverdale as a center for elephant rehabilitation. A group of high school students volunteered to coordinate social media campaigns to raise awareness and donations. The owner of the abandoned mill property tentatively offered to discuss land use for a potential sanctuary. Most surprising was the intervention of Martha Reynolds, wife of the injured handler. Against her family's wishes, she stood to address the gathering. "Tom's been with Stardust for 20 years, she said quietly, and in all that time, I've never once heard him speak kindly about the animals. He calls them beasts and monsters even at home. What happened was terrible, and he's hurting. But," she paused, gathering courage, "but maybe it wasn't entirely unprovoked." This admission from the victim's own family member created a significant shift in the room's dynamics. Percy Winters immediately requested a recess to consult with his clients by phone, and Mayor Wilkins granted a 15-minute break. As people milled about discussing the testimonies they'd heard, Jessica Ramirez approached James and Lily with a photographer in tow. "This is going to be the front page," she told them. "And not just in the Register. I've had calls from papers in St. Louis and Kansas City asking for the story. People are calling it The Girl and the Elephant, and it's getting traction online. The IC meeting's momentum clearly favored Ellie's advocates, but as the proceedings resumed, Percy Winters revealed the circus's counter-strategy. "My clients appreciate the community's concern," he began smoothly, "but wish to clarify that no decision regarding their property will be made under duress or public pressure. They have therefore accelerated their departure schedule and will be leaving Riverdale tonight, taking all of their assets, including the elephant, with them." A collective gasp went through the room. Mayor Wilkins leaned forward. "Mr. Winters, I issued a municipal hold delaying any action regarding the elephant pending safety review, which my clients are contesting as beyond your authority," Winters replied. "In the meantime, they are exercising their right to transport their property across state lines, where your municipal order has no standing." The announcement threw the meeting into disarray. James immediately approached the mayor, speaking urgently. "They can't just leave. We need an emergency injunction." "On what grounds?" Mayor Wilkins asked, though her expression suggested she was already considering options. "They own the animal, James." "Cruelty investigations," Dr. Chen suggested, joining them. "I have documentation concerning conditions that warrant further review before the animal is moved." As the adults debated legal strategies, Lily slipped quietly from the hall. The commotion inside had provided perfect cover for her exit, and no one noticed the small girl racing down the street toward the circus grounds, determined to see Ellie one last time before the circus could spirit her away. By the time James realized his daughter was missing, Lily had already reached Stardust's makeshift compound, where frantic activity confirmed Winters's announcement. Workers were dismantling tents, loading equipment, and preparing animals for travel. Near the back, Ellie was being guided into a massive transport trailer by handlers using bullhooks to direct her movements. "Stop!" Lily shouted, ducking under security ropes and racing toward the elephant. "You can't take her!" Two handlers turned in surprise, one reaching to intercept the child. But before he could grab her, something unexpected happened, something that those present would later struggle to explain coherently. Ellie, already halfway into the transport container, suddenly trumpeted with a force that shook the trailer. She backed out rapidly, causing the handlers to scatter, and positioned herself between Lily and the men, her massive body forming a protective barrier as her trunk gently curled around the girl's shoulders. This was the tableau that greeted James. Dr. Chen, Mayor Wilkins, and dozens of Riverdale residents as they arrived moments later, a small child embraced by an elephant many had labeled dangerous, both surrounded by bewildered circus workers, unsure how to proceed without risking further incident. In that frozen moment, as cameras captured images that would soon circulate worldwide, something fundamental shifted in how Ellie was perceived. No longer merely property or a dangerous animal, she had demonstrated a capacity for choice, for protection, for relationship that transcended traditional human understanding of elephants' capacities. And in doing so, she had unknowingly triggered a chain of events that would transform not only her own fate, but the future of an entire community. The true depth of her intelligence and the extraordinary bond forming between elephant and child were only beginning to reveal themselves, depths that would soon challenge scientific understanding and capture the world's imagination. The standoff at the circus grounds created an unexpected tableau. Ellie standing protectively over Lily, while circus workers, townspeople and officials watched in stunned silence. For several breathless moments, no one moved, uncertain how to proceed without provoking the elephant further. It was Bradley Keller, Stardust Circus's owner, who broke the tension. A heavy-set man in his 60s with thinning grey hair and the perpetual scowl of someone who'd spent decades battling declining profits, Keller pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger. "Get that kid away from my elephant!" he shouted, pointing at Lily. "And get the tranquilizer gun," he added in a lower voice to one of his staff. James stepped forward immediately, hands raised in a placating gesture. "No one needs to get hurt. Here, my daughter has been interacting safely with Ellie all week. Your daughter," Keller spat, "is trespassing on circus property and interfering with a scheduled transport. I could have her arrested." Mr. Wilkins moved to stand beside James. "Mr. Keller, I'm Patricia Wilkins, Mayor of Riverdale. Given the unusual circumstances and the pending review of this animal's status, I strongly suggest we all take a step back and discuss this calmly." "There's nothing to discuss," Keller retorted. "I own this elephant. I decide what happens to her, and right now I've decided that we're leaving town tonight." As the adults argued, Lily remained beneath Ellie's protective trunk, whispering reassurances to the elephant. "It's okay, Ellie. We won't let them hurt you." To everyone's astonishment, the elephant responded by gently stroking Lily's hair with the tip of her trunk, a gesture of such obvious tenderness that several onlookers gasped. Even more remarkably, she then used her trunk to draw Lily slightly backward, as if intentionally increasing the distance between the child and the agitated circus owner. Dr. Chen, who had been observing the interaction with professional fascination, spoke up. "Mr. Keller, what we're witnessing here is extraordinary. This level of protective behavior toward a human from a supposedly dangerous elephant suggests cognitive and emotional capacities that warrant further study." "I'm not running a research facility," Keller snapped. "I'm running a business, and that business is hemorrhaging money while we stand here debating." The arrival of Percy Winters added a new dimension to the confrontation. The attorney pushed through the crowd, briefcase in hand, his expression shifting from confident to concerned as he assessed the situation. "Mr. Keller, a word please," he said, pulling his client aside for a hurried consultation. Taking advantage of this momentary distraction, James approached Lily and Ellie cautiously. "Lily, honey, we need to step away now. We're going to solve this, but standing here isn't helping." "I can't leave her, Dad," Lily replied, her voice trembling. "They'll put her in that trailer and take her away to be killed." Before James could respond, Bradley Keller returned from his consultation with Winters, his anger now tempered with calculated shrewdness. "Here's what's going to happen," he announced, addressing the gathered crowd as much as the officials present. "The circus is leaving on schedule. The elephant comes with us. That's non-negotiable. However," he added, raising a hand to forestall protests, "in recognition of the community's concerns, we will delay any decisions about euthanasia until we reach our next stop in Springfield." Percy Winters stepped forward to elaborate. My client is willing to allow a qualified independent veterinarian to conduct a full behavioral assessment at that time. If the elephant is deemed rehabilitatable, Mr. Keller is open to discussing transfer options with legitimate sanctuary facilities that can meet our financial terms. And what are those terms? James asked, immediately recognizing the maneuvering for what it was. Keller smiled thinly. $250,000. That's my investment in this animal over her performing lifetime. I'm a businessman, not a monster. Pay her fair market value, and she's all yours. The pronouncement sent a ripple of reaction through the crowd. $250,000 was an impossible sum for a small-town fundraising effort, especially given the short timeline. Mayor. Wilkins frowned. And if payment can't be arranged? Then business proceeds as planned, Keller replied simply. The elephant has reached the end of her economic usefulness. Keeping her fed, housed, and medically cared for costs thousands each month. I'm not running a charity. While this negotiation continued, Jessica Ramirez was quietly filming on her phone, capturing both the standoff and Ellie's continued protective posture toward Lily. Sensing an opportunity, the young reporter edged closer to the circus owner, Mr. Keller, Jessica Ramirez, from the Riverdale Register. If Ellie is so dangerous, why is she currently cradling a child with her trunk instead of harming her? And wasn't the incident with Tom Reynolds preceded by use of a bullhook on an arthritic animal? Keller's face darkened. No comment, and put that phone away before I have security confiscate it. Freedom of the press, Mr. Keller, Jessica replied calmly, and this is public property. She continued recording as she asked, is it standard practice at Stardust Circus to euthanize animals when they're no longer profitable? The calculated questioning in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras pushed Keller into a corner. His expression hardened as he recognized the public relations disaster unfolding in real time. Final offer, he said tersely. You have until we reach Springfield. In 3 days to come up with the money. After that, I do what's necessary for my business. With that ultimatum delivered, he gestured to his staff. Prepare for departure. The elephant stays secure, but travels with us. Dr. Chen interjected quickly. As the attending veterinarian, I need to certify she's fit for transport. That will require a full examination. Fine, Keller conceded grudgingly. 1 hour, then we're on the road. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with discussions about Keller's demand and the extraordinary scene they had witnessed. James finally convinced Lily to step away from Ellie, though the separation was clearly difficult for both child and elephant. We'll find a way, he promised his tearful daughter, but right now we need to let Dr. Chen do her job. As the veterinarian began her examination, James pulled Mayor Wilkins and Frank Taylor aside for an urgent conversation. We need to buy more time, he said in a low voice. 3 days and $250,000 is impossible. Frank nodded grimly. I've already got Jessica sending the story to national outlets. This is the kind of human-animal drama that gets attention, but even with massive publicity, that kind of fundraising is a long shot. What about legal options? James asked the mayor. Patricia Wilkins sighed. I've already called the county judge. Without evidence of criminal animal cruelty, which is difficult to prove under Missouri's current laws, we can't prevent them from transporting their legally owned property. So Keller gets to set an impossible price, knowing we can't meet it, then proceed with his original plan anyway, James summarized bitterly. Not necessarily, a new voice interjected. They turned to find Miguel Ramirez approaching, the rescue center's large mammal specialist, whom James had consulted earlier. I've been making some calls, Miguel explained. There's a wealthy donor in California who funds elephant rescues. She might be interested, especially given the unusual circumstances here. Hope flickered briefly, but James remained cautious. Even if she is, 3 days isn't much time to arrange transfer of funds, transportation logistics, and a permanent placement. Which is exactly what Keller is counting on, Frank observed. He gets to look reasonable by offering a solution he knows is practically impossible. As the adults strategized, Lily stood at the edge of Ellie's enclosure, watching Dr. Chen complete her examination. The elephant kept her gaze fixed on the child, ignoring the veterinarian's procedures as if they were minor annoyances compared to maintaining this crucial connection. "You're going to be okay," Lily whispered, pressing her palm against the metal barrier. "I promise." In response, Ellie extended her trunk once more, this time using it to trace another pattern in the dirt, not a simple circle this time, but a more complex design that caused Dr. Chen to pause her examination and take notice. "That's remarkable," the veterinarian said, crouching to study the marks. "It almost looks like a figure 8, Lily finished. "She's done it twice now." Dr. Chen quickly took photos with her phone before continuing her examination. When she rejoined the group of officials 20 minutes later, her expression was troubled. "Ellie is technically transportable," she reported, "but I have serious concerns about her psychological state. She's displaying signs of acute stress, and forcing her separation from Lily at this point could trigger unpredictable responses." "Meaning she might become dangerous again?" Mayor Wilkins asked. "Possibly," Dr. Chen acknowledged, "or she might shut down entirely. Elephants can experience psychological collapse under severe stress, sometimes refusing food and water to the point of self-harm." Bradley Keller, overhearing this assessment, interjected impatiently, "So sedate her for transport. We've done it before when necessary." "I cannot ethically recommend sedation for an elephant in her condition," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "The combination of her age, arthritic pain, and psychological stress creates significant cardiac risks with heavy sedatives." "Then what exactly are you recommending, Doctor?" Keller demanded. Dr. Chen looked directly at the circus owner. "That Ellie remains in Riverdale until a proper transition plan can be developed. I'm formally documenting that immediate transport presents unacceptable medical risks." "Unacceptable to whom?" Keller retorted. "I have 3 veterinarians on retainer who will disagree with your assessment, none of whom have examined this specific animal under these specific conditions." "Doctor," Chen countered, "would you prefer I call the USDA to arbitrate the dispute? I'm sure they'd be interested in a full inspection of all your animals before transport." The threat of a federal inspection, which could potentially delay the circus's departure by days and result in costly citations, finally penetrated Keller's obstinance. After another hurried consultation with Percy Winters, he proposed a modified arrangement. The elephant stays for 72 hours under Dr. Chen's supervision, he conceded, reluctantly. The rest of the circus proceeds to Springfield, as scheduled. At the end of that time, either payment is made in full or one of my handlers returns with the transport trailer. No extensions, no negotiations. It wasn't a victory, but it was a reprieve. As the terms were finalized, James pulled Dr. Chen aside. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I know you put yourself professionally on the line with that stance." "I'm following the medicine," she replied simply, "and there's something else you should see." She showed him the photos of Ellie's dirt drawings, flipping between several images taken over the past hour. "Look at the consistency of the pattern. This isn't random trunk movement, it's intentional representation." James studied the images with growing amazement. "What do you think it means?" "I'm not sure," Dr. Chen admitted. "But I've contacted a colleague at the University of Missouri who specializes in elephant cognition. She's driving down tomorrow to observe firsthand." As arrangements were made for Ellie to remain temporarily in Riverdale, the logistics presented immediate challenges. The elephant couldn't stay on the vacated circus grounds, which were scheduled for immediate cleanup by the Walmart management. She needed appropriate shelter, food, water, and security. Riverdale's citizens, many of whom had witnessed the dramatic standoff, began offering solutions with surprising enthusiasm. Jason Wright, who owned the town's largest construction company, and, ironically, was Tom Reynolds' brother-in-law, volunteered the use of an empty warehouse on his property. "It's got high ceilings, concrete floors with drains, and I can have my crew reinforce anything that needs strengthening," he offered, seemingly unbothered by his family connection to the injured handler. Just good business sense to be on the right side of something the whole town's talking about. Mayor Wilkins quickly established a crisis committee to handle the logistics of Ellie's temporary stay, while Frank Taylor and Jessica Ramirez coordinated media outreach and fundraising efforts. Within hours, a Save Ellie Facebook page had thousands of followers, and local businesses were setting up donation jars at their registers. Bradley Keller watched these developments with poorly concealed contempt. As the last of his circus vehicles prepared to depart, leaving only Ellie behind with a single handler who had volunteered to stay, he approached James with a parting shot. "You're all deluding yourselves," he said coldly. "That animal is worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for her, and that number isn't going to magically appear in 3 days. When my man comes back with the trailer, you'll have accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable and costing me money." James met the circus owner's gaze steadily. "You might be surprised what people can accomplish when they care about something beyond its monetary value." Keller laughed humorlessly. 30 years in this business has taught me otherwise. Want some free advice? Keep your daughter away from my elephant. Getting attached to animals is bad business, especially ones with expiration dates." As Keller walked away, James felt a surge of resolve. The circus owner's callous attitude crystallized everything wrong with Ellie's situation. The reduction of a sensitive, intelligent being to mere property, valuable only for the profit she could generate. By nightfall, Ellie had been carefully relocated to Jason Wright's warehouse at the edge of town. The space had been rapidly converted with fresh hay, water troughs, and the beginnings of what Dr. Chen called environmental enrichment: logs, branches, and large rubber balls designed to provide sensory stimulation for captive elephants. More remarkable than the physical transformation of the warehouse was the community energy coalescing around the effort. Volunteers had appeared throughout the evening, bringing food for the human workers, offering supplies, or simply wanting to help in whatever way they could. The initial controversy had evolved with surprising speed into a unifying project for a town that had seen little collective purpose since the mill's closure. James, exhausted but encouraged by the day's unexpected developments, finally insisted that Lily return home for dinner and rest. She'd spent hours sitting near Ellie, talking softly and occasionally offering approved treats under Dr. Chen's supervision. "We need to give her space to adjust to her new surroundings," he explained, gently, "and you need sleep. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow. Can I come back first thing in the morning?" Lily asked, reluctantly gathering her things. "Of course," James promised. "Dr. Chen says Ellie seems calmer when you're present, so you're officially part of her care team now." This designation brought a smile to Lily's tired face. As they prepared to leave, she approached Ellie one last time. "Good night," she said softly. "I'll be back tomorrow." The elephant, who had been exploring her new space with cautious trunk movements, paused at the sound of Lily's voice. She approached the child, careful to move slowly with Dr. Chen, and the handler watching nervously nearby. Then, in a gesture that left even the skeptical handler open-mouthed, Ellie gently touched her trunk to her own forehead and then to Lily's, a movement reminiscent of traditional greeting gestures observed among wild elephants. "She's saying goodnight back," Lily whispered, understanding instinctively what they were witnessing. On the drive home, through the darkened streets of a town now buzzing with unexpected activity, James found himself reflecting on the extraordinary turn of events. Just that morning, Ellie had been a circus elephant scheduled for euthanasia. Now she was at the center of a community mobilization, with experts being summoned and national media attention brewing. What had begun as his daughter's impossible mission was transforming into something larger than any of them had anticipated. Yet beneath the momentary triumph loomed Bradley Keller's ultimatum: 72 hours to raise $250,000, or Ellie's journey would end exactly as the circus owner had planned all along. As Lily fell asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted from the day's emotional roller coaster, James's phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. Got through to the California donor. She's interested but cautious. Wants more info about the elephant's condition and long-term placement options. Also, check your email. You've got media requests from St. Louis, Kansas City, and 2 national outlets. This is getting big, fast. James allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps Keller had miscalculated in setting such a short deadline. The circus owner hadn't anticipated the perfect storm of factors that made Ellie's story so compelling: a child's determination, an intelligent animal's apparent choice, a struggling town's need for purpose, and the power of modern social media to amplify it all. Yet even as these possibilities swirled, James recognized the formidable challenges ahead. They weren't just fighting Keller's deadline. They were battling established legal frameworks that classified sentient beings as property, economic realities that made elephant care prohibitively expensive, and the practical question of what would happen to Ellie even if they somehow raised the money in time. Tomorrow would bring a nationally recognized elephant cognition expert to Riverdale, along with whatever media attention Jessica and Frank had managed to generate overnight. The quiet routine of their small-town life had been irrevocably disrupted, and at the center of the storm stood an elephant whose apparent intelligence and bond with a 9-year-old girl was challenging fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness. As James carried his sleeping daughter from the car to her bed, he whispered a promise similar to the one Lily had made to Ellie. "We're going to find a way." Across town in the hastily converted warehouse, Ellie stood quietly in her new space, free of the chains that had restricted her movement for decades. Under Dr. Chen's orders, only safety barriers had been installed, no restraints, no shackles. The elephant methodically explored the perimeter of her temporary home, her trunk investigating every corner, every texture. Then, in a moment, observed only by the night volunteer watching over her, Ellie returned to the spot where Lily had sat. For hours, the elephant used her trunk to gather hay, arranging it in a neat pile at that exact location. Once satisfied with her creation, she settled herself nearby, positioned to keep watch over the space her young human friend had occupied, as if guarding it until Lily's return. The news about Ellie spread like wildfire overnight. By 6 the next morning, 3 television vans had parked outside the warehouse where the elephant was being temporarily housed. Reporters from St. Louis and Kansas City stood in the pre-dawn chill, delivering live updates for their morning broadcasts about the elephant standoff in small-town Missouri. Social media buzzed with the hashtag #ChuckSaveEllie, and the fundraising page Frank Taylor had hastily created showed over $15,000 in donations. Impressive for a few hours, but still far short of the $250,000 ransom. James awoke to find Lily already dressed and ready, organizing her backpack with fresh apples, a sketchbook, and the children's book on elephant behavior she'd been studying all week. "I thought we could read to Ellie today," she explained, holding up the book. Dr. Chen said enrichment activities are important for captive elephants. The determination in his daughter's face both inspired and worried James. In just a few days, Lily had invested herself completely in Ellie's fate. The looming deadline cast a shadow over her enthusiasm. What would happen if they failed to raise the money in time? How would his daughter handle that heartbreak? "That's a wonderful idea," he said, pushing those concerns aside for the moment. "But we need to eat breakfast first. It's going to be a busy day." When they arrived at the warehouse, they found a transformed scene. What had been a hurried emergency setup the night before had evolved into something more organized. Volunteers had constructed a proper barricade to keep spectators at a safe distance while allowing Ellie some visibility. A local landscaping company had donated several small trees in massive pots, creating a more natural environment within the cavernous space. Someone had even painted a colorful "Ellie's Temporary Home" sign that hung over the entrance. Mayor Wilkins was already there, speaking with Jason Wright about further improvements to the facility. She waved James and Lily over as they approached. "We've established a volunteer schedule," she informed them, handing James a printed roster. 4-hour shifts around the clock. Food and water delivery, waste management, security. Everyone's pitching in. "This is incredible," James said, scanning the list of names, many of whom he recognized as long-time Riverdale residents who had never shown particular interest in animal welfare before. "People needed something to care about," the mayor replied, simply. "But we still have the bigger problem of Keller's deadline. The town council is meeting at noon to discuss what municipal resources can be allocated. But honestly, our options are limited." Inside the warehouse, Dr. Chen was conducting Ellie's morning examination, while Dennis Mitchell, the circus ticket taker who had volunteered to stay behind as a familiar presence for the elephant, supervised her feeding. "She ate well overnight," Mitchell reported when he spotted James. "And she's been doing that drawing thing again." He pointed to several areas where distinctive patterns had been traced in the hay covering the concrete floor. Dr. Chen looked up from her notes. "I've documented everything and sent photos to Dr. Priya Varma. She's the elephant cognition specialist arriving this afternoon. Priya thinks the consistent figure-8 pattern might be significant." Lily moved closer to the safety barrier, and immediately Ellie's demeanor changed. The elephant's ears perked forward, her posture straightened, and she made a soft rumbling sound deep in her throat that Dr. Chen identified as a greeting vocalization rarely heard in captive elephants. "Good. Morning, Ellie," Lily called. "I brought you some apples and a story to read." What happened next astonished everyone present. Ellie carefully picked up one of the small rubber balls that had been placed in her enclosure as enrichment and carried it to the front of the barrier. With deliberate movements, she placed it on the ground directly in front of Lily, then stepped back, her trunk extended expectantly. "She's offering you a gift," Dr. Chen said, her scientific detachment momentarily forgotten. "And I think she wants you to roll it back." Lily looked to the adults for permission, and when Dr. Chen nodded, she reached through the barrier to roll the ball back to Ellie. The elephant immediately engaged, gently pushing it back toward the child. "She's playing with me," Lily exclaimed. "With delight. More than that," Dr. Chen murmured, filming the interaction. "She's initiating cooperative play. That's extremely sophisticated social behavior." Word of this extraordinary development quickly spread outside, where Jessica Ramirez was coordinating media access. Soon cameras were capturing the simple but profound game between child and elephant, broadcasting images that would significantly shift public perception of the situation. By mid-morning, the warehouse had become the epicenter of activity in Riverdale. Local businesses sent employees with coffee and donuts for the volunteers. Children arrived with parents to catch a glimpse of the famous elephant. The high school art class showed up with their teacher to create informational posters about elephant conservation. The fundraising total continued to climb. $27,000, then $35,000, then $42,000. But the rate was slowing, and simple math made it clear they wouldn't reach the target at the current pace. James stepped outside to take a call from Miguel Ramirez, who had been liaising with the potential California donor. "Elizabeth Blackwood wants to speak with you directly," Miguel said without preamble. "She's watched the morning news coverage and has questions about Ellie's condition and the long-term plan." "There is no long-term plan yet," James admitted, feeling the pressure of the ticking clock. "We've been focused on the immediate crisis. Then I suggest you develop one quickly," Miguel advised. "Miss Blackwood doesn't invest in temporary solutions. If she's going to help, she needs to know this isn't just about buying an elephant from a circus, but creating sustainable care for the next several decades." The conversation with Elizabeth Blackwood an hour later was both encouraging and daunting. The wealthy philanthropist, speaking via video call from her California estate, was clearly knowledgeable about elephant welfare and skeptical of quick-fix solutions. "I've seen too many well-intentioned rescues fail for lack of proper planning," she explained, her crisp voice matching her elegant appearance. "An Asian elephant can live 60-plus years in proper conditions. Ellie may have another 15-20 years ahead of her. That's a multi-million-dollar commitment when you factor in proper habitat, specialized veterinary care, and trained staff." "We understand that," James assured her, though in truth, he hadn't fully calculated the long-term financial implications. "Right now, we're focused on preventing her euthanasia, but we're exploring partnership options with established sanctuaries, most of which have waiting lists years long," Ms. Blackwood pointed out. "I've reviewed Dr. Chen's preliminary reports, and Ellie's behavioral patterns are indeed fascinating. The apparent bond with the child, the communication attempts, it warrants further study. But emotion can't drive these decisions. What happens when media attention fades? When fundraising dries up? When will your daughter eventually lose interest?" The last suggestion stung, but James kept his composure. "With all due respect, Ms. Blackwood, my daughter's commitment isn't a passing phase, and what's happening in Riverdale isn't just about one elephant or one child. It's becoming something larger." "That remains to be seen," she replied, though her tone had softened slightly. "I'll tell you what. I'll send my foundation's veterinary team to evaluate Ellie personally. They'll arrive tomorrow morning. If their assessment confirms Dr. Chen's findings regarding her cognitive abilities and rehabilitation potential, I'm prepared to contribute significantly to your fundraising effort. But," she emphasized, "only if there's a concrete plan for Ellie's long-term care. I don't fund rescues, Mr. Morgan. I found solutions." It wasn't the immediate financial commitment they desperately needed, but it was hope. As James ended the call, he found Mayor Wilkins waiting to speak with him, her expression concerned. "We've got trouble," she said quietly, leading him away from the warehouse entrance where volunteers continued to manage the growing crowd. "Percy, Winters filed an emergency injunction this morning, challenging my authority to delay the elephant's transport. The county judge has scheduled a hearing for tomorrow at 10 a.m., but that cuts our time frame even shorter," James protested. "Exactly," the mayor confirmed grimly. "If the judge rules in the circus's favor, we could lose Ellie before Miss Blackwood's team even arrives." The legal challenge represented a calculated move by Bradley Keller, attacking the already tight deadline from another angle, applying maximum pressure to force a hasty resolution on his terms. James realized the circus owner was more strategic than he had initially given him credit for. "So we need legal representation," James concluded. "Who's the best attorney in town?" The mayor's expression told him everything before she spoke. "Percy Winters, and the second best works at his firm." "What about Springfield or St. Louis?" "Onche. Less than a day's notice for a case involving complex animal property law that most attorneys have never handled." Mayor Wilkins shook her head. "We're looking, but don't expect miracles." Inside the warehouse, oblivious to these new complications, Lily was reading aloud to Ellie from her elephant book. The massive animal stood completely still, her trunk occasionally reaching toward the child, as if encouraging her to continue. Dr. Chen continued documenting these interactions, her scientific interest clearly growing with each new observation. The atmosphere shifted with the arrival of Dr. Priya Varma, the elephant cognition specialist from the University of Missouri. A petite woman in her 40s, with keen dark eyes and an air of restrained excitement, Dr. Varma wasted no time with pleasantries before focusing her complete attention on Ellie. "How long has she been engaging in the figure-8 marking behavior?" she asked Dr. Chen, after reviewing the photographic evidence. "Consistently since yesterday, though Lily reports seeing her make circular patterns earlier in the week," Dr. Chen replied. Dr. Varma nodded thoughtfully. "And the interactive play behavior began this morning?" "Yes, unprompted. She deliberately selected the ball and initiated the exchange." "Fascinating." Dr. Varma turned to Lily, who was watching their discussion while maintaining contact with Ellie through the barrier. "Would you mind showing me how you two communicate? Just interact naturally as you've been doing." Lily nodded and turned back to the elephant. "Ellie, this is Dr. Varma. She's here to learn about you and help us." The elephant's gaze shifted briefly to the newcomer before returning to Lily. Then, with deliberate movements, Ellie used her trunk to trace another figure-8 pattern in the hay, larger and more distinct than her previous markings. "She does that when she's trying to tell me something," Lily explained matter-of-factly. "But I don't always understand what she means." Dr. Varma's scientific composure briefly faltered. It's extraordinary. The figure-8 is a mathematical symbol for infinity. In elephant cognition studies, we've documented captive elephants mastering representational art, but typically only after extensive training. Spontaneous symbolic communication is exceedingly rare. "So you think she's actually trying to communicate something specific?" James asked, having returned in time to catch this exchange. "I think it's premature to draw conclusions," Dr. Varma replied, regaining her professional caution. "But what I will say is that these behaviors, the consistent pattern-making, the initiated cooperative play, the selective response to your daughter, all indicate cognitive processes well beyond what's typically documented in circus elephants, whose natural intelligence is often suppressed by their training and environment." The specialist spent the next hour conducting a series of gentle tests, with Lily's help, to further assess Ellie's cognitive abilities. She presented simple problems for the elephant to solve. Food hidden under one of 3 identical containers. A treat placed just beyond reach, requiring the use of a provided stick to retrieve it. A matching exercise with colored balls. Ellie's performance was remarkably consistent. Not only did she solve most of the challenges, but she did so with an efficiency that suggested she understood the underlying principles rather than responding to specific cues. In the wild, elephants develop complex problem-solving skills as part of their natural development, Dr. Varma explained as she recorded her observations. What's unusual here is seeing these abilities emerge so rapidly in a circus elephant who's likely had no opportunity to exercise these cognitive muscles. For decades, it's as if a door has been unlocked in her mind. "Lily unlocked it," Dennis Mitchell suggested quietly from where he'd been observing. When the others turned to him in surprise, the elderly circus worker elaborated. "I've watched Ellie for 15 years. She was always just there. Following commands, going through motions, nothing behind the eyes. Then this little girl shows up and starts talking to her like she's somebody, and suddenly there is somebody there." Dr. Varma nodded slowly. "There's a phenomenon in captive animal psychology, sometimes called learned helplessness. After years of punishment for independent thinking or action, animals essentially shut down higher cognitive functions. They exist, but they stop being. It's possible that the unconditional, expectation-free interaction with Lily created a safe space for Ellie to reclaim some of her suppressed capacities." As fascinating as these developments were, James couldn't help but feel the pressure of their dwindling time. Each remarkable demonstration of Ellie's intelligence made the threat of her return to the circus more unbearable. Yet they were still far from the financial goal that would secure her freedom. He stepped outside to check on the fundraising progress and found Frank Taylor updating the gathering crowd. The total had reached $68,000. Impressive for small town. Mobilization in less than 24 hours, but still not even a third of what they needed. "We've got interest from a morning show in New York," Frank informed him. "They want to do a live remote tomorrow, if we can arrange it. That kind of national exposure could boost donations significantly." "If we still have Ellie tomorrow," James replied, filling Frank in on the legal challenge Keller had mounted. The newspaper editor frowned. "That's playing dirty, but not surprising. Keller strikes me as a man who's used to getting his way." A commotion at the perimeter drew their attention. Tom Reynolds had arrived, his arm in a cast and his face set in a mask of anger as he pushed through the crowd. "Where's the sheriff?" he demanded loudly. "This whole circus is illegal. That animal assaulted me, and now you're treating it like some kind of celebrity?" Sheriff Dan Parker, who had been maintaining a low profile throughout the situation, stepped forward. "Take it easy, Tom. Everything here is being done with proper permits and safety measures." "Safety measures?" Reynolds scoffed, pointing at children who were being allowed to view Ellie from the designated safe distance. "That thing is dangerous. It should have been put down immediately after attacking me." The confrontation was drawing media attention. Exactly what they didn't need with the hearing looming tomorrow. James approached cautiously. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand your concern," he began diplomatically. "You were injured and that's unacceptable. But there were circumstances." "Circumstances?" Reynolds cut him off. "The only circumstance is that your kid's been filling everyone's heads with fairy tales about the poor, misunderstood elephant. It's a wild animal that snapped, and you're all going to be sorry when it happens again." Martha Reynolds appeared from the crowd, looking mortified by her husband's outburst. "Tom, please, you promised you'd stay home today." "So you can keep siding with them," he retorted. "My own wife, acting like I did something to deserve getting my arm broken." The public argument was creating exactly the kind of divisive scene that could damage their cause at a critical moment. Recognizing this, Mayor Wilkins intervened with the political skill that had kept her in office for 2 decades. "Tom, your concerns are valid and are being taken into account," she said firmly. "In fact, why don't you come to my office right now, where we can discuss potential compensation from the town's insurance policy for your medical expenses and lost wages? That seems more productive than creating a spectacle here." The strategic mention of financial compensation shifted Reynolds's focus immediately. As the mayor deftly escorted him away, Martha Reynolds approached James with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry about that," she said quietly. "He's been taking more pain medication than he should, and it makes his temper worse." "It's understandable," James assured her, though he wondered how much of Reynolds' anger was medication-induced versus his natural disposition. "For what it's worth," Martha continued, glancing toward the warehouse, "I think what you're doing is right. Tom's never been kind to animals, not even our own dogs. Whatever happened with that elephant, well, I wouldn't be surprised if he provoked it somehow." This unexpected support from the injured handler's wife gave James pause. Throughout this ordeal, he'd been constantly surprised by where assistance came from and where resistance arose. People he'd barely interacted with during his years in Riverdale were now volunteering countless hours to save Ellie, while some he'd considered friends questioned his judgment in pursuing this lost cause. Inside the warehouse, unaware of the confrontation outside, Lily continued working with Dr. Varma and Ellie. The elephant had become increasingly responsive throughout the day, displaying problem-solving abilities that astonished even the specialist. "I'd like to try something," Dr. Varma said, retrieving a specialized tablet from her equipment bag. "This is an app we've been developing for great ape cognition studies. It's essentially a simple communication board with touch-activated symbols and corresponding sounds." She showed the device to Lily. "Each of these images represents a basic concept: food, water, happy, sad, yes, no, and so on. When touched, it produces the corresponding word. Some captive great apes have learned to use similar systems to express basic needs and even simple thoughts." "Do you think Ellie could learn to use it?" Lily asked, eyes wide with possibility. "Typically it would take months of consistent training," Dr. Varma cautioned, "but given what I've observed today, it's worth introducing the concept. At minimum, it gives us another way to assess her cognitive processing." With Dr. Chen's permission, they mounted the tablet on a sturdy stand just inside the safety barrier, positioned where Ellie could reach it with her trunk. Dr. Varma demonstrated the system for Lily first, touching symbols that produced corresponding words through the device's speaker: food, touch, water, touch, happy, touch. Lily quickly grasped the concept and demonstrated for Ellie, narrating as she did. "See, Ellie, when I touch this picture of an apple, it says food, and this water drop says water. You could tell us what you want." The elephant observed with apparent interest, her trunk hovering near the barrier as she watched the demonstration. Then, with careful precision, she extended her trunk through the opening and touched the screen. "Happy," said the electronic voice. The humans exchanged startled glances. It could have been coincidence, a random touch that happened to land on a symbol. But then Ellie touched the screen again, more deliberately. "Happy," and again, "happy." "That's not random," Dr. Varma whispered, her scientific reserve crumbling in the face of what they were witnessing. 3 consecutive identical selections. "Has a probability so low it can't be dismissed as chance." Lily beamed up at the elephant. "Are you happy, Ellie? Because we're trying to help you." As if in direct response, Ellie again extended her trunk to the tablet, but this time she selected a different symbol. "Sad," said the electronic voice. The juxtaposition of emotions caused Dr. Varma to lean forward intently. "Lily, ask her another question. Something specific about how she's feeling." "Ellie," the child said carefully, "are you sad about going back to the circus?" The elephant's response was immediate and chilling in its clarity. She touched the same symbol repeatedly, with increasing force. "Sad, sad, sad." In that moment, as the electronic voice flatly repeated the emotion, something profound shifted in the warehouse. No longer were they discussing an animal's welfare in abstract terms of ethics and compassion. They were witnessing direct communication from a being expressing her own emotional state, a paradigm-shifting demonstration that would fundamentally alter the conversation about Ellie's fate and challenge the very legal frameworks that classified her as mere property. Outside, unaware of this breakthrough, the clock continued ticking toward Bradley Keller's deadline and tomorrow's court hearing. That could derail everything. The fundraising thermometer showed just over $70,000, less than a third of what they needed, with less than 48 hours remaining. But inside, a 9-year-old girl and an elderly elephant had just changed the rules of engagement in ways no one could have anticipated. 3 months after the dramatic events in Riverdale, a gentle autumn sun bathed the newly constructed observation deck in warm golden light. Lily Morgan sat cross-legged on the wooden platform, her school books spread around her as she worked on homework. Occasionally, she glanced up to check on Ellie, who roamed freely in the 5-acre habitat that now occupied what had once been abandoned mill property on the edge of town. The elephant looked like a different being entirely. Her dull, listless demeanor had vanished, replaced by an alert curiosity as she explored her environment. The chronic wounds from decades of chains, had healed, leaving only faint scars. Her once thin frame had filled out with proper nutrition, and even her arthritis seemed to trouble her less as she moved with growing confidence across the varied terrain specially designed for her comfort and stimulation. "Need any help with that math?" James asked, joining his daughter on the deck with 2 cups of hot chocolate. "I've got it," Lily replied, accepting the steaming mug gratefully. "I was just taking a break to watch Ellie. She found another hidden treat in the enrichment puzzle Dr. Varma set up this morning." James smiled as he observed the elephant systematically investigating a complex feeding station that required manipulation of different mechanisms to release food rewards. Her problem-solving skills are improving every week. Dr. Varma says she's documenting abilities that challenge existing research on elephant cognition. "That's because most elephants don't have communication tablets," Lily said with pride, glancing at the specialized, weather-resistant touchscreen mounted at elephant trunk height near the observation deck. The device, a vastly improved version of the prototype Dr. Varma had introduced during those critical days of Ellie's rescue, now featured over 100 symbols that the elephant used with increasing sophistication. What had begun as simple emotional expressions had evolved into rudimentary sentences as Ellie combined symbols: "Ellie want apple," "Lily come play," "Water cold good." The journey from that pivotal moment in the warehouse to this peaceful scene had been anything but smooth. Looking back, James could identify the exact turning point that had transformed what seemed like certain defeat into an unexpected victory. It had come during the courthouse hearing just 2 days after Ellie's communication breakthrough. Bradley Keller had arrived confident in his legal position, accompanied by Percy Winters and 2 additional attorneys from St. Louis. They had presented a straightforward property rights case. The elephant belonged to Stardust Circus, the temporary hold imposed by Mayor Wilkins exceeded her authority, and the fundraising effort had failed to meet the agreed-upon financial terms. Their argument was legally sound, and with the total donation stalled at just under $100,000, far short of Keller's demanded $250,000, the outcome had seemed inevitable. Even with Elizabeth Blackwood's veterinary team confirming Ellie's extraordinary cognitive abilities, the wealthy donor had been unwilling to commit the full remaining amount without guarantees of a sustainable long-term plan. Then, Dr. Priya Varma had taken the stand. Rather than offering typical expert testimony, she had brought the communication tablet and a video compilation of Ellie's responses over the preceding 36 hours. With the court's reluctant permission, she played footage of the elephant consistently selecting appropriate symbols to answer simple questions, expressing preferences and, most powerfully, repeatedly selecting sad and afraid when shown. Images of the circus trailer and bullhooks. Your Honor, Dr. Varma had explained, her academic credentials lending weight to her words. What you're witnessing is not trained behavior or random selection. Statistical analysis confirms that these responses occur with a consistency that defies explanation as coincidence. This elephant is demonstrating communicative intent. She is telling us, in the only way available to her, that she understands the situation and has preferences about her own future. The judge, a practical man not known for sentimentality, had watched the footage with growing discomfort. While fascinating, Dr. Varma, I fail to see how this changes the legal question before the court. Animals remain property under Missouri law, regardless of their apparent intelligence. It was at this moment that the unexpected advocate had risen from the gallery. Elizabeth Blackwood herself had flown in overnight after reviewing her team's findings. The elegant philanthropist, known for funding conservation efforts worldwide but rarely appearing personally in such situations, had approached the bench with her own attorney. Your Honor, I'd like to petition the court for standing to present a third option. she had announced. The Blackwood Wildlife Foundation is prepared to purchase the elephant in question for the full asking price, contingent upon immediate transfer of ownership not to an individual or to the town of Riverdale, but to a newly established trust. With a novel legal structure, Percy Winters had immediately objected, but the judge, intrigued by the presence of such a noteworthy figure, had allowed Ms. Blackwood to continue. My foundation's legal team has drafted what we believe is a precedent-setting framework, she explained, as her attorney distributed documents to the court. Drawing on recent legal developments regarding the protection of natural resources through rights of nature doctrines, we propose establishing Ellie as the beneficiary of a trust that would own itself, with a board of trustees responsible for ensuring her welfare according to specific legally binding guidelines. The courtroom had erupted in murmurs at this unprecedented proposal. Keller had leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued by the mention of the full purchase price. While the judge studied the documents with a furrowed brow, "This is highly irregular," he finally stated. "You're essentially asking this court to recognize an elephant as something other than property, which exceeds my authority as a county judge." "Not precisely, Your Honor," Ms. Blackwood's attorney had countered smoothly. "We're asking the court to recognize a novel trust arrangement, which is well within established legal precedent. The trust itself would technically be the owner, with the elephant as beneficiary rather than property, a distinction that allows us to remain within existing legal frameworks while acknowledging the unique ethical considerations this case presents." After hours of legal arguments, with Keller's attorneys fighting to dismiss the proposal and Ms. Blackwood's team defending its legitimacy, the judge had reached a Solomon-like decision. He would allow the Blackwood Foundation to purchase Ellie from Stardust Circus for the full asking price, with the understanding that the legal status of the proposed trust would be decided in a separate hearing after additional legal research. For Keller, the outcome satisfied his primary concern, financial compensation, and extracted him from a public relations situation that had grown increasingly uncomfortable as Ellie's communication abilities made national headlines. With evident relief, he had accepted the certified check and signed the transfer documents, washing his hands of the elephant that had become more trouble than she was worth. For the people of Riverdale, the resolution had initially seemed bittersweet. They had rallied around saving Ellie, only to have an outside benefactor swoop in at the last moment. But Ms. Blackwood had surprised everyone with her next announcement. The Blackwood Foundation recognizes the extraordinary community effort that brought this situation to our attention, she had stated at an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps. Therefore, while we will provide the financial resources and legal framework to secure Ellie's future, we propose establishing the physical sanctuary right here in Riverdale, on the former mill property, if the town approves rezoning. This would create jobs, educational opportunities, and a model for how small communities can participate in wildlife conservation. That proposal had transformed disappointment into celebration. Within weeks, construction had begun on what would become the Ellie Blackwood Sanctuary for Elephant Cognition, a unique facility combining cutting-edge research opportunities with compassionate care for its singular resident. Now, 3 months later, James reflected on how that crisis had unexpectedly revitalized Riverdale. The abandoned mill property had been repurposed, creating construction jobs immediately and permanent positions as the sanctuary took shape. Local businesses benefited from increased visitor traffic, with weekend tourists coming to learn about Ellie's story and observe her remarkable communication abilities. More than the economic impact was the renewed sense of community purpose. Volunteers still maintained a regular schedule, helping with sanctuary operations. The high school had developed special courses in animal behavior and conservation. Even Tom Reynolds, who had initially been Ellie's most vocal opponent, had gradually shifted his position after his medical bills were covered by a special fund established through the sanctuary. "Dad, look!" Lily's excited voice pulled James from his reflections. "Ellie's coming to use her tablet." The elephant had indeed approached. The communication device, her movements deliberate as she extended her trunk toward the screen. They watched as she selected a series of symbols with careful precision. Ellie, happy. Lily's friend, stay home. The simple yet profound message brought a smile to James's face. Home. That was what they had created here, not just a sanctuary or a research facility, but a place where an elephant who had known nothing but captivity and performing for most of her life could finally experience something like freedom and belonging. "She's using 3-word combinations consistently now," noted Dr. Varma, who had approached silently behind them. The researcher had relocated to Riverdale permanently, accepting a position as the sanctuary's lead scientist. At this rate, her symbolic vocabulary could exceed 200 words by next year. "What does that mean for your research?" James asked, knowing how significantly Ellie's abilities had already challenged existing scientific understanding of elephant cognition. Dr. Varma shook her head in wonder. "It means we've barely scratched the surface of what these animals are capable of. The question isn't whether Ellie is exceptional, though she certainly is, but how many other captive elephants might have similar untapped capacities if given the right environment and communication tools." This possibility had become the sanctuary's broader mission. Under Elizabeth Blackwood's guidance, they weren't just providing a home for one elephant, but developing protocols and technologies that could be implemented at facilities worldwide, potentially transforming how humans understood and interacted with these complex beings. The implications extended beyond elephants. Ellie's case had sparked renewed academic and ethical discussions about animal cognition, personhood, and the moral responsibilities humans might have toward other thinking species. The innovative legal structure of the Ellie Trust was being studied by environmental and animal rights attorneys as a potential model for other situations involving highly intelligent animals. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sanctuary grounds, Dennis Mitchell arrived for his evening shift. The former circus worker had become one of Ellie's most dedicated caretakers, his decades of experience with elephants, now redirected toward healing rather than performing. "How's our girl doing today?" he asked, joining them on the observation deck. "See for yourself," Lily replied, pointing to where Ellie had returned to the communication tablet after exploring another section of her habitat. They watched as the elephant selected symbols with growing confidence. "Dennis, come. Ellie shows new." "Well, I guess I'm being summoned," the elderly man chuckled, making his way down to the habitat entrance. She found something she wanted to share. This had become a regular occurrence, Ellie actively seeking to engage her human companions in her discoveries, whether a particularly satisfying mud wallow or an interesting insect in her environment. Each shared experience further cemented the remarkable cross-species relationships forming at the sanctuary. "It's still hard to believe sometimes," James said quietly to Dr. Varma as they watched Dennis join Ellie in the habitat. 3 months ago, she was scheduled for euthanasia. Now she's helping redefine how we understand elephant intelligence. "The scientific community remains divided," Dr. Varma acknowledged. "Some of my colleagues argue that we're anthropomorphizing, projecting human characteristics onto her behaviors. Others question whether symbolic communication truly reflects abstract thought or merely associates actions with rewards." "And what do you think?" James asked. The scientist smiled as she watched Ellie carefully showing Dennis a small sapling she had apparently discovered in a corner of the habitat. "I think we're witnessing something that challenges our human-centric view of consciousness. Whether or not Ellie thinks exactly as we do is less important than recognizing she thinks in her own way. a way that deserves respect and protection. Lily, who had been listening to this exchange while packing up her schoolbooks, added her own perspective. Ellie told me yesterday that she remembers things from before, from the circus, and even earlier. She said Ellie remembers the baby, mother, trees. I think she might be recalling her life before captivity. This possibility that Ellie's awakening cognition might be accessing long-suppressed memories from her early life had profound implications. Asian elephants were known for their exceptional long-term memory, with wild elephants recognizing migration routes and water sources unused for decades. Could Ellie be reconnecting with memories from before her circus training, perhaps even from her earliest years with her family herd? Dr. Varma made a note to explore this in tomorrow's research session. Every day, she shows us something new, the scientist remarked with undisguised wonder. It's as if she's been waiting her entire life for the opportunity to be known. As evening settled over the sanctuary, the small group gathered in the observation building for their nightly routine. Dr. Varma reviewed the day's research notes, Dennis prepared Ellie's evening medications for her arthritis, and Lily completed her homework while occasionally glancing out the window to check on her elephant friend, who was contently arranging branches in her night shelter. Mayor Wilkins arrived with the weekly update on sanctuary developments. The educational center construction is ahead of schedule, she reported happily, and we've just confirmed a major university partnership for the research program. They'll be sending graduate students starting next semester. Ellie needs companionship of her own kind, Ms. Blackwood had explained during her monthly video conference with the Sanctuary Board. As remarkable as her relationships with humans are, elephants are profoundly social beings who thrive in family and groups. We're currently evaluating several candidates from closing zoos who might integrate well with her. The prospect of bringing additional elephants to Riverdale had accelerated the sanctuary's development plans. Construction teams were now working on expanded habitats, specialized medical facilities, and a more comprehensive research center. The economic impact on the town continued to grow, with new businesses opening to serve the increasing number of visitors and researchers. For Lily, the transformation went beyond the physical changes to the sanctuary or even the improvements in Ellie's health and communication. Now 10 years old, she's become something of a celebrity in animal welfare circles, receiving invitations to speak at schools throughout the region about her experience. With her father's support, she had established a youth conservation club that already counted over 50 local children as members. What's your favorite thing about working with Ellie? A visiting fifth-grade class had asked during a recent educational tour. Lily had considered the question carefully before answering. The best part is watching her become more herself every day. When I first met her, she was like a shadow. Now, she's full of personality and opinions and ideas. She's teaching us as much as we're teaching her. This mutual exchange of knowledge had become a defining characteristic of the sanctuary's approach. Rather than imposing human conceptions of what an elephant should be or do, the team worked to create environments and opportunities that allowed Ellie to express her own preferences and abilities. The communication system had evolved based on her usage patterns, adapting to her needs rather than forcing her to conform to human expectations. She's developed her own syntax, Dr. Varma explained to a visiting group of linguists. Not English grammar, but a consistent internal logic to how she combines symbols. For instance, she typically places action symbols before object symbols, regardless of how we structure our questions to her. This discovery had prompted a complete reorganization of the communication tablet's interface, arranging symbols according to Ellie's apparent conceptual categories rather than human linguistic ones. The result had been an immediate increase in the complexity of her expressions. One afternoon, after months of consistent communication development, Ellie had produced a sequence that left even Dr. Varma momentarily speechless. Ellie remembers mother gone, Lily's new family. The statement, expressing both historical memory and an abstract concept of familial connection, had prompted a flurry of academic papers and sparked renewed debate about the depth of elephant emotional lives. For Lily, however, it had simply confirmed what she had intuitively understood from their first meeting. Ellie was a person, not in the human sense, but in the way that mattered most. A being with her own inner world, capable of remembering, suffering, connecting, and healing. Later that evening, as James and Lily prepared to head home, they stopped for their nightly goodbye to Ellie. The elephant approached the fence line where they stood, extending her trunk in greeting. "See you tomorrow, Ellie," Lily said, reaching out to touch the offered trunk. "I'll bring that new book about elephant families to read to you." The elephant turned to the nearby communication tablet, selecting symbols with deliberate care. "Lily, come tomorrow. Ellie waits. Family." The word choice, family, caught James by surprise. It was not one of the symbols they had specifically taught Ellie, yet she had incorporated it into her growing vocabulary, seemingly understanding its deeper meaning. As they walked to their car under a sky brilliant with stars, Lily looked up at her father. "Mum would have loved Ellie, wouldn't she?" "She would have," James agreed, feeling a bittersweet certainty that Caroline would have been at the forefront of this unlikely crusade. She always believed in fighting for what matters, even when it seemed impossible. "That's why we couldn't give up," Lily said, with the simple wisdom that had guided her throughout this journey, "because sometimes the most important things seem impossible until somebody tries anyway." The sanctuary lights illuminated Ellie's massive silhouette as she arranged her sleeping area for the night, a simple, profound act of agency that had been denied her for decades. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new communications, new insights into the mind of a being who had been dismissed as merely property until a 9-year-old girl had seen the person beneath the captivity. For Ellie, each day brought fresh experiences of autonomy and connection. For the humans whose lives had become intertwined with hers, each day brought humbling reminders of how much remained to be learned about the other conscious minds sharing their world. And for Riverdale, a town that had been slowly fading into economic obscurity, each day brought new visitors, new opportunities, and new purpose. The legacy of what had happened here would extend far beyond this one elephant and this one small town. Already, activists were using Ellie's case to advocate for other captive animals. Researchers were developing similar communication systems for different species. Legal scholars were debating the implications of the trust model for future animal protection frameworks. But for Lily Morgan, watching the sanctuary fade into the distance as they drove home, the most important outcome was much simpler. Ellie was safe, Ellie was healing, and Ellie was finally being recognized for who she truly was. Not a circus attraction or a scientific subject, but a being with her own inner life, her own preferences, and her own capacity for joy. In that recognition lay the true miracle of their unlikely journey. Not just that a child had saved an elephant from death, but that in doing so she had helped remind a cynical world that compassion could still prevail against the cold calculations of profit and precedent. That small acts of determined kindness could still ripple outward in ways that transformed not just individual lives, but entire communities, and perhaps, eventually, society itself. 6 months after Ellie's rescue, the sanctuary welcomed its second resident, an elderly female Asian elephant named Maya, who had spent 40 years performing in a traveling show before it went bankrupt. The introduction process had been carefully managed by Dr. Varma and Dennis Mitchell, with Ellie's preferences given priority throughout. The moment when the two elephants first touched trunks had brought tears to even the most scientific observers. After decades of isolation from their own kind, these intelligent social creatures recognized something in each other that no human relationship, however loving, could provide. Their rumbling vocalizations, inaudible to human ears, but felt as vibrations through the ground, spoke of connections that transcended their shared histories of captivity. Within days, Maya had begun showing interest in the communication tablet, watching intently as Ellie demonstrated its use. By the end of her first month at the sanctuary, she had mastered several key symbols, beginning her own journey toward expressing the inner life that had been silenced for so long. For Ellie, the arrival of a companion seemed to accelerate her own healing and cognitive development. Having someone who shared her experiences, who understood elephant ways of being without translation, provided a completeness to her world that had been missing even in the sanctuary's compassionate environment. As for Lily, now preparing to enter middle school, the miracle that had begun with her simple refusal to accept injustice continued to unfold in ways she could never have imagined when she first glimpsed a sad-eyed elephant in a traveling circus. Her dream of becoming a wildlife veterinarian had solidified into a clear vision for her future, inspired not just by her father's profession, but by the extraordinary journey she had shared with Ellie. "You know," James said, as they watched the two elephants explore their habitat together one Sunday afternoon, "I think your mother somehow guided you to Ellie. She always had a way of finding those who needed help the most." Lily smiled, considering this possibility. Maybe Ellie was waiting for us all along. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps in the vast, interconnected web of life, certain souls are destined to find each other across seemingly insurmountable divides of species, circumstance, and expectation. And perhaps the most profound changes begin not with grand gestures, but with one individual looking at another and simply refusing to accept that nothing can be done. As the sun set over the sanctuary, Ellie used her trunk to gently guide Maya toward the communication tablet. Together, the two elephants stood before the device that had revolutionized understanding of their cognitive abilities. With careful precision, Ellie selected a sequence of symbols, sharing with her new companion the concept that had perhaps meant the most to her throughout this extraordinary journey. Not alone. Home now, safe. In those simple words lay the essence of what had been accomplished, not just a rescue from physical danger, but a restoration of dignity, connection, and hope that would continue to ripple outward through countless lives, both human and animal, for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.